It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. My own work in Africa is in West Africa, in Senegal, with the Mandinka, with whom I've lived and worked for 5.5 years, 3 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, and then 2.5 years doing doctoral research. And but I teach in the university several classes on Africa. In fact, I'm the Africanist on the faculty. And what that means is that I do teach more than just my area of specialty. And one of the great pleasures is to be able to do that, because you can get really caught in your narrow area of research, and before you know, the rest of the continent disappears. But the reason I mention that is where we must begin in thinking about your family with whom you are working or are hearing about now, is that up until about 25 to 30 years ago, for most people who lived on the continent of Africa, there was no Africa. That is, Africa as a word is a word that came out of European need to designate a place that they were beginning to enter into as early as the 16th and 17th century. But Africa as an idea, a continent, for example, of many, many peoples, really was not part of most people's thought. It was for the outsiders looking at it, but not for those who were within it. So right away, I want to say that what I'm going to try to do in the 30 minutes I have, and I'm supposed to keep track of the time very carefully, so I'm going to have to be done by about 10 minutes out, is I'm going to be doing what anthropologists do to some extent, which is to share what I'm thinking about, but to frame it with some language from those people who live in that part of the world, Eastern Congo, which some of you may know is an area that has experienced extraordinary violence for over a century now. And much of that violence is not something that people invited upon themselves. It's something that came along with the European package, if you will, and the subsequent consequences of colonialism. Most of us would like to think that the colonial endeavor was one of bringing the world into what Europe thought was the civilized world. And yet, as early as the 15th century, European missions were involved in Central Africa, in the Congo, and were very much in contact with the complexity and the riches and the significant political sophistication of peoples who were there and had been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So one of the things we have to get over is this idea that we're discovering a continent. What you're all doing is you're meeting a family with a very specific perspective. And I can hear from the brief history I've heard, it's not been an easy one. So I want to give you a flavor of this part of the Congo, the Eastern Congo. And in doing that, I want to start with a very brief 10-minute overview from the Foreign Affairs Council on Foreign Affairs, to sort of give you some visuals and maybe a little bit of ethno-history. All right, so that's where we'll start, if you don't mind. And then my plan is to then make a few comments to perhaps answer some questions that were raised by the film, but I understand there'll be a chance perhaps for questions from both of us, both presenters, at the end as well. But I welcome questions. And then with a few comments from me, ending up in the last 4 minutes with a wonderful animated film by Ben Affleck's team, who is involved in something called the Eastern Congo Initiative, which is a positive thing. One of my challenges in teaching Africa to my students, and particularly the regions I teach, is that it can be a pretty grim picture from about 1884 to the present. 1884 being when the Berlin Conference, to use the word of King Leopold, took pieces of the cake for themselves, the cake being Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. That history, I try to fill with what I know, having lived and worked there as a volunteer and then as a researcher, which is life for those who are there in their communities is not an African life, it's a Mandinka life, or an Efe life, or a Lesse life, I don't know the ethnicity of the family with whom you have or will be working, but they no doubt have that ethnic history, that very local history, dislocated because of a refugee situation. But part of that refugee situation will be explained in this film, so you get a sense of what pushed them into Tanzania. Maybe that's enough to say to get started. All right? So let me just get things up here. We'll take a couple of seconds.